My Lords, will the Noble Lord the Minister confirm that aid is being admitted into Gaza by the Israelis more quickly than the UN and the other agencies can distribute it? On one day last week, for example, 222 trucks were admitted, but only 158 were distributed, and only 86 of those by the UN. So the barrier is not Israel admitting aid into Gaza. And furthermore, can he explain to the House how it is possible for him to say that the government supports Israel's right to defend itself, but then for the government to threaten to withhold arms exports on which that defence may depend?
On the Noble Lord's second point about threatening on arms export, I don't believe I've said that. And on his earlier point, I'm sorry, I don't agree with him. As we've seen directly through the exchanges we've had with Kogat, there has been a real challenge. There have been British trucks, British aid waiting on the borders of Gaza. He quotes the numbers, I quoted greater numbers than he did. We have seen a change, an uptick, but a small uptick in the trucks entering. If he hasn't visited, when you go and you see the backlog of trucks, let's be very clear, what's happened in Gaza is there is no infrastructure. The UN in itself is not getting the visas it needs. He shakes his head, this is fact. We've been lobbying on this. This is our advocacy. We have a very strong relationship with Israel. When Mr. Gantz visited London, both the Foreign Secretary and I made very clear about the importance, and Israel recognises its responsibilities. It has. It is a democracy. It has international obligations and its adherence to international humanitarian law. And what we are seeing is, because of the advocacy of countries such as the United Kingdom, there has been some movement. We have seen an increase in aid going, but this is not enough. There's also put the 500-600 trucks before. I have looked at that in detail. We have looked quite specifically. Let's also be clear that there were certain produce that was produced within Gaza. That's no longer happening. What is needed right now, and the report that we discussed only a few days ago was very clear. We need to avert a humanitarian famine taking place, and Israel has an important role to play in this.
Does the Minister appreciate that the Security Council has turned into a completely dysfunctional organisation? The Security Council rejected a resolution a couple of days ago that would have linked the release of the hostages to a ceasefire. It turned it down. This time, the two conditions are not linked together. They are not enforceable. It is no more possible to enforce the release of hostages than it is to enforce a ceasefire against Khamaas, which was not mentioned in that resolution. Will the Minister push for the Red Cross to be allowed to visit the hostages, push for those hostages to be released first? And will he also note that the news we are getting from Gaza is almost totally unreliable, because so much of it comes from journalists who are controlled or are in the pocket of Hamas? Will he focus on those hostages? And I'm sad to say, how empty is that phrase, never again?
My Lords, I disagree with the Noble Lady, and I'm sad to say this. Of course I'm focused on the hostages. I've met hostages not once, not twice, not 3 times, several times over. I said in my statement about the importance of recognising their suffering. I met with, again, a hostage mother only last week, as did the Foreign Secretary. So the premise of saying that we're not focused on the hostages is, frankly, it doesn't add up. Secondly, I don't agree with her on assessment of the UN Security Council. Yes, it's been challenging, but what we saw yesterday was the Security Council coming together. And on her earlier point, let me just read this. I have the Security Council resolution in front of me. Acknowledging the ongoing diplomatic efforts of Egypt, Qatar and the United States aimed at releasing the cessation of hostilities, releasing the hostages and increasing the provision and distribution of humanitarian aid. There are 3 provisions in that. The first demands immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a sustainable ceasefire, and also demands, this is within the same point 1, the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, as well as ensuring humanitarian access. So I'm sure Noble Lords in reading, and I invite the Noble Lady to read the resolution, it's very clear.
I wonder if my noble friend the Minister has seen the reports that some settler groups, I think mainly in the United States, are now passing up bits of Gaza and selling them off, and if there is any truth to these reports, what his comments on those would be. Secretary of State Blinken has been rather ahead of the British government in condemning the activity of illegal settlers by describing them as illegal under international law, whereas we have sanctioned named settlers. Can we expect to move closer to the American position on this? And if it is the case that these settlers are being encouraged illegally by the Netanyahu government, why do we continue to sell them arms?
My Lords, I assure my noble friend we work very closely with the United States, and let me again say something that I've repeated, my noble friend has repeated. It's been a consistent position of every government I can remember that settlements in the West Bank and Gaza are illegal and they are against international law. The issue of arms and arms exports, I've already alluded to the issue of our own arms exports, but also the importance of adherence of Israel to international humanitarian law.
Lords, given that we...
Aid agencies have reported that the list of goods allowed by the Israeli government into Gaza is hard to access and is subject to change without warning. I wonder if the Noble Lord the Minister can say whether any diplomatic initiatives have been taken to put pressure on the Israeli government to publish an official list of those things allowed in and to make sure that they cover all of the nutrition, food and medical requirements which are clearly needed in this situation.
My Lords, I assure the noble lady in all our interactions directly with Israel, we do make the case of ensuring there is clarity on what is. There has been, I've seen it myself through the warehouses near Al Aroush that we visited together with the Foreign Secretary, that we saw rejected goods under the banner of dual purpose. So we asked for that clarity, we'll continue to do so, and that is why it was important to appoint a coordinator who is doing an excellent job in establishing some of these real clarity on what's allowed in. We're working with key agencies on the ground and ensuring that the acute needs are directly met. There is a need for immediate food and basic foods to enter Gaza. There is a need for basic medicines to enter Gaza, and we're making that case very clearly to Israel. Let me say again, the United Kingdom rightly is a friend to many countries, including Israel. But being a friend means, as we did, and this House stood together, we stood with Israel when those horrific events unfolded on the 7th of October. I've said myself that on that particular day, it's perhaps reflective of the period we're in from an Abrahamic perspective. There were 3 calls I made to Israel. One was to a friend of mine who is Muslim in Israel. The second was to a friend of mine who is Jewish, who was in Israel. And the third was to the Christian Archbishop Hossam in Jerusalem. Why? Because this is a common cause of our common humanity. And Israel is a country which is a democracy. It is a country that we recognize as a friend. But it's also important that the other side of the coin is that we challenge and present constructive advocacy and bring a lasting solution to this conflict, which we would all agree, irrespective of where we come at, from what angle, has gone on for too long and has cost far, far too many lives.
My lords.
That famine was imminent, but that was 10 days ago, so Gaza is experiencing famine right now. My Noble Lord the Minister gave examples of aid that is getting through, which is only a fraction of what's needed, because the Israeli government is constantly putting barriers in the way. My Noble Lord Minister stated that now the Israeli government wants to flood Gaza with aid. Are they just words? Will the Noble Lord the Minister acknowledge that the Israeli government is responsible for the mass starvation of Palestinians?
My Lords, I alluded earlier to the report which came out from the IPC, and that's why we're working around the clock to ensure that the points that we make to Israel, as I said before in our last meeting with Minister Gantz, the point of humanitarian access, the need to deliver humanitarian aid was very clear and accepted, and that's why we persist on this. I've acknowledged also there has been an uptick on a greater number compared to last month of trucks which are going in, but still this is not enough. It is important we see the kind of aid going in. We do see this ceasefire now coming into place for the period of Ramadan, but something which lasts to allow for sustainable ceasefire to take place and for ultimately the reconstruction which is needed so desperately to begin and to people to start rebuilding their lives.
Lords, given that, my Lords, given that, given that we all described, in my view, quite rightly, the dreadful attack on southern Israel as resulting in the deaths of 1,200 people as slaughter, what language is left to describe the deaths in Gaza of 33,000 Palestinians, including 13,500 children? That includes toddlers and babies. How do we describe that? Is killing on that scale consistent with Israel's rights, which we all respect, to self-defense? Is it necessary? And in view of international humanitarian law, is killing on that scale in Gaza and the horror that is Gaza today a proportionate response by Israel?
My Lords, of course, any person that's been killed in this conflict or it's tragedy beyond belief. The number of people that have been killed in Gaza is shocking. What happened on the 7th of October was shocking. We see innocent civilians that have been impacted, whether we're talking about the hostage families who continue to be impacted, or indeed the thousands upon thousands of people who have been killed in Gaza. This is a human tragedy. I've described it as a catastrophe in many sense, and that's why it needs all noble-intentioned countries now to come together, act as one. We need to bring this and make sure the resolutions that have been passed, this isn't the first one. There was Resolution 2720 that was passed specifically on humanitarian access, that the resolutions that have been passed by the Security Council are fully implemented. Hamas is different to Israel. We expect Israel to adhere to IHL. Hamas is a terrorist organization. We're talking about two very different entities, and that is why we will never give up hope and continue in our strong advocacy, our work with key partners in ensuring that we can bring this tragic conflict to an end, because I'm sure the noble Lord, we all acknowledge that the loss of any life, any innocent life, is tragedy beyond belief.